Welcome to DebtCircle Sundown Brief for the 18th of May 2026. Here's your complete roundup of India's debt markets, money markets, government securities, currencies, commodities, and primary bond issuances. Starting with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds traded today. Ambium Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 18.81% with a trade value of Rs 0.10 lakhs. Kirtana Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 18.45% with a trade value of Rs 0.36 lakhs. Midland Microfin Limited recorded a yield of 16.54% with a trade value of Rs 2.00 lakhs. Agri Exchange 2025 recorded a yield of 16.50% with a trade value of Rs 100.00 lakhs. Housing and Urban Development Corporation Limited recorded a yield of 16.50% with a trade value of Rs 35.00 lakhs. Now moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds traded today. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of Rs 4,246.67 lakhs. Cholamandalam Investment and Finance Company Limited recorded a yield of 9.32% with a trade value of Rs 20.00 lakhs. Mahindra and Mahindra Financial Services Limited recorded a yield of 7.85% with a trade value of Rs 1,000.00 lakhs. Anand Rathi Global Finance Limited recorded a yield of 7.50% with a trade value of Rs 38.00 lakhs. Another trade in Anand Rathi Global Finance Limited recorded a yield of 7.50% with a trade value of Rs 456.00 lakhs. Moving to mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at Rs 15,955.72 crore. Gross sales stood at Rs 19,122.74 crore. Net investment stood at negative Rs 3,167.02 crore. Net investment for May month to date stood at negative Rs 32,482.720 crore. Now let's look at foreign portfolio investor activity in the debt market. Under the general limit category, gross purchases stood at Rs 250.96 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 431.81 crore, resulting in a net investment of negative Rs 180.85 crore. Under the VRR category, gross purchases stood at Rs 687.65 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 257.69 crore, resulting in a net investment of Rs 429.96 crore. Under the FAR category, gross purchases stood at Rs 1,271.16 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 476.63 crore, resulting in a net investment of Rs 794.53 crore. Net investment for May month to date stood at negative Rs 238.16 crore under the general limit category, negative Rs 26.30 crore under VRR, and Rs 3,737.30 crore under FAR. For calendar year 2026 year to date, net investment stood at negative Rs 3,533 crore under the general limit category, negative Rs 1,430 crore under VRR, and Rs 13,945 crore under FAR. Now moving to money market rates. Call rates stood at 5.18%. Tri-party repo stood at 5.07%. Basket repo stood at 5.14%. Special repo stood at 5.01%. Here are the India government bond yields. 1-year government bond yield stood at 6.15%. 3-year yield stood at 6.63%. 5-year yield stood at 6.93%. 7-year yield stood at 7.07%. 9-year yield stood at 7.00%. 10-year yield stood at 7.13%. 15-year yield stood at 7.42%. 30-year yield stood at 7.71%. Now let's look at Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs. 91-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.34%. 182-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.53%. 364-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.77%. Moving to liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative rupees 1,44,896 crore. Standing deposit facility or SDF stood at rupees 1,46,865 crore. Marginal standing facility or MSF stood at rupees 1,969 crore. Now moving to MIBOR OIS rates. 1-year MIBOR OIS stood at 6.27%. 2 years stood at 6.52%. 3 years stood at 6.65%. 5 years stood at 6.85%. Modified MIFOR rates were as follows. 2 years stood at 7.30%. 3 years stood at 7.30%. 4 years stood at 0.00%. 5 years stood at 0.00%. Now moving to currency markets. US dollar to Indian rupee stood at 96.36 compared with the previous close of 96.00. Euro to Indian rupee stood at 112.08 compared with the previous close of 111.61. British pound to Indian rupee stood at 128.71 compared with the previous close of 127.92. Japanese yen to Indian rupee stood at 0.61, unchanged from the previous close of 0.61. Chinese yuan to Indian rupee stood at 14.14 compared with the previous close of 14.10. Now here's a quick snapshot of commodities and equity indices. Gold 24 carat 99.9 purity stood at rupees 15,622 per 10 grams compared with the previous level of rupees 15,693. Silver stood at rupees 2,900 per 10 grams compared with the previous level of rupees 2,800. Crude oil stood at $109.11 per barrel compared with the previous level of $109. Sensex closed at 75,315.04 compared with the previous close of 75,237.99. Nifty closed at 23,649.95 compared with the previous close of 23,643.50. Finally, let's look at India's primary corporate bond issuances. Globe Capital Market Limited announced an issuance of rupees 300 crore with a tenure ranging from 25 to 31 months across multiple tranches, carrying a coupon of 9.19% and rated AA- by ICRA Limited. Globe FinCap Limited announced an issuance of rupees 200 crore with a tenure ranging from 25 to 31 months across multiple tranches, carrying a coupon of 9.19% and rated AA- by ICRA Limited. That's all for DebtCircle Sundown Brief for the 18th of May 2026. This is Leela signing off. Stay tuned for more updates on India's debt and fixed income markets.